Okay, so imagine a bill shows up in your mail. It's not for your internet, it's not for your rent, it's for a war your great-grandfather fought. We're talking about trenches dug and bullets fired long before your parents were even born. It sounds completely nuts, right? Well, it's not.
Yeah, this isn't some weird hypothetical question. It's something that actually happened, and the answer is honestly staggering. So let's dive in and unpack how one country spent almost 100 years paying for a single war. So on October 3rd, 2010, some clerk in a German finance office, hits a button and authorizes a wire transfer for this amount, 69.9 million euros. Now, this wasn't for a new highway or some kind of government bailout. No, this was the final payment for World War I, a war that ended way back in 1918, was only officially paid off in 2010. That's 92 years. For 3 generations, Germans were paying for a war their ancestors fought. So you gotta be asking the same question I did. How on earth does a single bill last for 92 years? What even was this debt? And what kind of chaos could it cause over that much time? The story is absolutely wild. To find out where this all started, we have to hop in a time machine and go all the way back to 1919. We're in the Palace of Versailles, the Great War is over, but as it turns out, the financial war was just getting started. The whole thing was built on something called the War Guilt Clause. See, buried in the Treaty of Versailles was this little thing, Article 231. And it wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a legal trap. It forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for the war, which meant, you guessed it, Germany had to pay for all of it.
So what was the final bill? In 1921, they landed on a number 132 billion gold marks. Now, to put that in perspective, and this is the crazy part, Germany's entire economic output, its total GDP, right before the war was only 50 billion. So the Allies were demanding almost 3 times the value of the entire country. It was literally mathematically impossible to pay.
And here's the kicker, they knew it. The British Treasury's expert at Versailles, a brilliant economist named John Maynard Keynes, he ran the numbers, saw they were insane, and quit in protest. He wrote this chillingly accurate prediction in 1919, saying that if you try to crush Germany with debt, it'll just lead to another, even worse, war. Of course, nobody listened.
And surprise, surprise, Keynes was right. The attempt to pay this impossible bill kicked off a catastrophic chain reaction. It wasn't just an economic crisis. It basically paved a superhighway from national debt straight to a dictatorship.
So when Germany couldn't pay, France and Belgium literally invaded their industrial heartland. To support the German workers who went on strike, the government did the only thing it could think of. It just started printing money. And the result was hyperinflation on a scale nobody had ever seen. The speed of it is just breathtaking. Look at that. In just over a year, the currency went from about 500 marks to $1 to 4.2 trillion. The human cost was the complete destruction of the middle class. Anybody who had savings, anybody with a pension, poof, gone, wiped out. Your entire life savings, built up over decades, suddenly couldn't even buy you a postage stamp. It was a national trauma that would shape German politics for decades. Then, the Americans came in with what they called a solution, the Dawes Plan. But just look at this cycle. It was basically a financial merry-go-round. U.S. banks would lend money to Germany, Germany would use that money to pay the Allies, and then the Allies would use that money to pay back their own war debts to the U.S. The only people really making out here were the American banks, who were collecting fees every step of the way. Germany just got deeper and deeper in debt. Now, this whole system was basically a house of cards built on American loans. So when the U.S. stock market crashed in 1929, the loans dried up, and the German economy just completely imploded all over again. By 1932, unemployment was at 30%. And what happens in the very next election? The Nazi Party, whose big promise was to tear up the Versailles Treaty, becomes the biggest party in the country. The connection here is, well, it's undeniable.
So when Hitler became chancellor, one of the very first things he did was make good on that promise. He just stood up and unilaterally canceled all the payments. For a German population that had been crushed by this debt for over a decade, this looked like a heroic act of defiance. It was wildly popular, and it absolutely cemented his power.
Now, of course, that defiance led directly to World War II. But here's where the story of the First War's debt takes another really weird turn. It didn't just vanish.
In 1953, the Allies met to figure out Germany's remaining debts. And for those old World War I bonds from the 1920s,
They stuck in this really clever little clause. They said payment was deferred until Germany was reunified. Now, back in 1953, with the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, that seemed like a polite way of saying never.
But then, the impossible happened. The Berlin Wall came down in '89. In 1990, Germany was reunified, and all of a sudden that never-gonna-happen clause was triggered. A 60-year-old debt basically came back from the dead. And to their credit, Germany honored the agreement and scheduled the final payments over the next 20 years, which brings us right back to that final transfer in 2000.
So, okay, fascinating story, but why does a 92-year-old debt matter to us today? Because the playbook, the whole system of using unpayable debt to drain wealth and maintain control, it's not a historical artifact. It is very much still in use.
Just look at this comparison. On the left, you've got the Versailles model. On the right, you see its modern-day echoes. The mechanics are basically the same. You impose these crippling debts that can't realistically be paid off, whether it's student loans that follow you for life or international loans that force entire countries into austerity. The result is always the same. Wealth gets extracted for generations, and society becomes unstable.
I mean, the Greek debt crisis is a perfect modern example. To get bailout loans, the country was forced into these brutal spending cuts. Pensions were slashed, youth unemployment hit 60%, the whole economy shrank. And after all that pain, guess what? Greece's total debt was actually higher than when it started. The loans were never meant to save Greece, they were meant to save the banks that owned the debt.
And that really brings us to the key lesson from this whole 92-year-long story. Unpayable debt isn't a tool for repayment. It's a weapon. It doesn't build anything. It just destroys. It doesn't create wealth for the person or country that's borrowing. It just locks them into a cycle of dependency.
The story of Germany's 92-year bill is really a huge warning from history. It shows that when you design debt to be impossible to pay back, it doesn't lead to repayment. It leads to economic collapse, political extremism, and eventually war. So the final question is really for all of us. Have we actually learned that lesson? Or are we just building the exact same destructive machine and just slapping